Good morning. I am Michael Kessler, professor and managing director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. Welcome to our discussion on promoting human rights in U.S. foreign policy, a deeply critical discussion that we are excited to launch over the coming months. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy and the Master of Science in Foreign Service program at the School of Foreign Service. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted to the event page on the Berkley Center's website. If you registered for today's event, you'll receive an email when that video becomes available. After our moderated conversation, we will have a Q&A with the Zoom audience. Please submit your questions by opening the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen and typing in your question. Judd Birdsall will moderate today's discussion with our esteemed colleagues Nicole Bibbins Sedaca, David Hollenbach, Mark Lagon, and David Little. Judd is the project director of the Transatlantic Policy Network on Religion and Diplomacy and a senior research fellow at the Berkley Center. From 2011 to 2020, Judd was based at Cambridge University, where he earned his PhD and founded the Cambridge Institute on Religion and International Studies. We're very happy to have Judd join the center recently, and we're very honored to have him moderate today's important discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over to Judd and the colleagues, and Judd will give slightly bigger introductions of each of our colleagues. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for being with us during a very busy day for you, as I know. Well, I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to moderate this panel discussion today on a very timely and important and indeed quite complex and challenging subject, the promotion of human rights in the Biden administration's foreign policy. It's an honor to be with such a distinguished group of panelists today, and it's my pleasure to introduce the four of them now. Nicole Bibbins Sedaca is a professor of the practice of international relations and serves as a concentration chair for global politics and security in the Master of Science in Foreign Service program at Georgetown University. She served for 10 years at the State Department, working on a number of democracy and human rights related issues. And she and I actually overlapped briefly in the department's Human Rights Bureau back at the end of the Bush administration. Mark Lagon is the Chief Policy Officer at Friends of the Global Fight Against AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. He's also an adjunct professor in the Master of Science in Foreign Service program at Georgetown and a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum. He served in a number of leadership roles, including the president of Freedom House and as U.S. ambassador at large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. David Hollenbach is the Pedro Arrupe Distinguished Research Professor in the Wall School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, senior fellow at the Berkley Center, and affiliated professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. And David Little is a research fellow at the Berkley Center, and he retired in 2009 as professor of the practice in religion, ethnicity, and international conflict at Harvard Divinity School, where he was also an associate in the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. Welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you for being with us today to share your insights, and I very much look forward to this conversation. As Michael mentioned, please do be a part of the conversation by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, typing your question there. Do be as brief as you can be so we can get through as many questions as possible. And if you'd like, you can give us your institutional affiliation. And please also know to which of the panelists you are directing your question. We'll begin by me posing some initial questions to our panelists, and then we'll have this time of Q&A later on in our time together. We have a full 90 minutes, so I think we'll have ample time for conversation. To open our conversation, I'd like to explore the context of the Biden administration's promotion of human rights under the heading of four interrelated challenges. And those are the conceptual, the reputational, the institutional, and the practical. To open things up, I have a conceptual question for our theorists and theologians, both of our Davids, David Little and David Hollenbach. And the question I have for them, once I take a sip of my water, is this. The argument is often heard that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is really just based on individualistic Western Enlightenment thought, and isn't particularly relevant to non-Western and more communitarian contexts, that the promotion of human rights is really just a form of ideological imperialism. A question that I would pose to both of you is this true? And what does this conceptual challenge mean for the Biden administration? Especially given that within the Democratic Party, you have a strong commitment to human rights on the one hand, but also a strong sensitivity towards things that might be perceived as imposing American or Western norms and values on other cultures. So that's the opening conceptual question I posed to David Little and David Hollenbach. Dr. Little, let's start with you.
Thank you. Well, I just expressed my appreciation of being part of this conversation, and I'm glad to be interacting with these esteemed colleagues. Let me open by common agreement with a couple of statements in respect first to the Biden orientation towards human rights policy, and then a mention of one critical response, which I hope sets up the theoretical problems, at least, and perhaps some of the practical problems that the Biden administration faces with its human rights policy prospects. In the spring of 2020, now President Biden declared a promise to convene a global summit for democracy to renew the spirit and shared purpose of the free world among the world's democracies by galvanizing, Biden said, significant new country commitments to advancing human rights in their own nations and abroad, along with fighting corruption and defending against authoritarianism. In particular, he said the best way to respond to the serious challenge represented by China is to build a united front of US allies and partners to confront China's abusive behavior and abusive human rights violations, even as we seek to cooperate with Beijing on issues where our interests converge, such as climate change, non-proliferation, and global health security. Now for the critical response, which comes, by the way, from an international scholar named Christopher Lane, writing in the Foreign Affairs Journal. Echoing what appears to be a growing spirit of resistance among some academics and a variety of political leaders toward Biden's proposal, one critic writes, in the face of a number of flashpoints that could trigger war, the Korean Peninsula, the South China Sea, and Taiwan, the US will need to avoid war by accommodating China's demand for respect as a great power equal. That would involve, Lane says, retracting the US security guarantees and recognizing Beijing's claims on Taiwan and presumably elsewhere. And he goes on to say, Washington would also need to accept the reality that its liberal values, presumably including human rights, are not universal, and thus the US should stop interfering in China's internal affairs by condemning Beijing's policies in Hong Kong and Xinjiang and issuing veiled threats for regime change. So it seems to me this contraposition of attitudes and outlooks poses our problem. And my response would be at two levels. I believe that the Biden administration will clearly want to respond to the criticisms of Christopher Lane and others by defending the universality of human rights and America's commitment to that. I think one of the questions that we will need to address in our discussion, and I hope future discussions, is on what grounds that universality might be defended. That seems to me the key theoretical question that any advocate of human rights faces. In relation to that is the question that Judd Birdsall raised about individualism, cultural imperialism versus other views of human decency around the world, and the possible conflict between an attitude toward human rights and those competing views. I would suggest, just by way of an introduction of thinking and reflection on this critical question, the Biden approach might be defended on two levels. One, at the what we could call textual or historical level, and the second at the more philosophical level. First, the textual one. Here, there's been a good deal of discussion among experts, scholars of the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. People like Johannes Morsink, and a recent book by Catherine Sickink called Evidence for Hope, Making Human Rights Work in the 21st Century. Both Morsink and Sickink argue that actually the drafting of the UDHR was a rather complicated process. It wasn't by any means simply undertaken by the global North, and prominently the US, UK, France, and so on. On the contrary, the very drafting process of the UDHR involved perspectives from a variety of cultures and backgrounds, especially, according to Sickink, the global South. She devotes several chapters in her book to the contribution made by Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, to the formulation of the UDHR, which of course becomes the primary document according to which the Biden administration, I suppose, will advance its human rights policies. That point about complexity of background in drafting is very important to setting the stage. And the argument will be, I would think, that the human rights formulated as they were against the background of fascist practice before and during World War II presented a problematic against which human rights were drafted that wasn't just assertions of Western views against Eastern. The world, in effect, in response to the fascist experience, faced a problem of the expansion of central political military power and the likely dominance of the use of that power on the citizens under the jurisdiction of the respective authorities. So the problematic of political dominance, use of force dominance by central authorities becomes, I think, the primary concern of the drafters. And these were drafters not just from the North, as I say, but from the South, from all over the world, who had experienced in one way or another this particular worry. So that the working out of the UDHR very much involved designing a set of rights that protected individuals, and critically individuals, against collective domination. That seems to me the most important problem to bring up. And that would lead me to suggest at the theoretical level that the question of the arbitrary use of power, the arbitrary use of force, is the underlying question that faces the world, including the Biden administration, as it defends a human rights approach. So the individualism that indisputably is part of the UDHR and the subsequent instruments, the International Covenant on Civil and Political and the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, those three primary documents embody the protection of the individual against torture, against enslavement, against the arbitrary taking of life, against various forms of degradation and cruel and inhuman punishment and treatment. Those fundamental so-called non-derogable rights, which are embodied in the documents, become the primary focus. And that focus, I would argue, in favor of the Biden approach, is fundamental still to the world that the United States faces. So both at the textual level and at the theoretical level, this emphasis on arbitrary use of force and the importance of defense of individuals against that becomes a terribly important response. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Little, for getting our conversation off to an excellent start this morning. David Hollenbach, your thoughts on this conceptual challenge?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with everyone here, and I look forward to some fruitful discussion. Let me pick up with what David Little has just said and build upon that. I think from a historical and textual point of view, he's absolutely correct that the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was not simply a Western undertaking. There were some major non-Western, non-European players in that. He mentions how Catherine Sicking stresses the participation of Latin Americans, and that was represented, for example, by Hernan Santa Cruz from Chile, who was a very active participant in the drafting process. But it also included, as the vice chair of the drafting committee, Peng Chang from China, and a Confucian thinker, Charles Malik from Lebanon, coming from the Middle Eastern world, Hansa Mehta, a woman from India, bringing in a perspective of a woman and also the perspective of the Indian subcontinent, etc. So the argument about universality, I think you can go back and look at these early drafting participants. Secondly, I would note historically, this debate about universality was very intense back in the late 1980s and especially the early 1990s, when we had a very important piece written by Lee Kuan Yew, who was the leader of Singapore, on Asian values as being somehow incompatible with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But there were some significant responses to Lee Kuan Yew coming from Asia itself. A very strong response to Lee Kuan Yew by Kim Daejung, who had been a dissident in Korea and eventually became the president of Korea. And he argued against Lee Kuan Yew that indeed human rights are universal. And he highlighted in an essay he wrote in Foreign Affairs that many centuries, long millennia before Locke, Mencius, a great Confucian thinker, defended the right of the people to resist an unjust, oppressive king. And for example, Mencius said, and I quote, "If the king does not govern righteously, the people have the right to overthrow his government in the name of heaven." The mandate of heaven being lost in the Confucian perspective means the people have the right to move forward. There are also similar arguments that were made by Amartya Sen, a very distinguished economist and philosopher, defending from an Asian point of view the universality of human rights. So I think we can see, going back to both the textual level, but also some of the debates that took place in the early 90s, that there are Asian voices defending the legitimacy of the universality of human rights. This led then at the Vienna World Congress on Human Rights that took place in 1993 to a very strong, they issued a declaration and program of action. And this was an assembly of leaders of the whole world gathered there. And they stated, and this is a quote from the Declaration and Program of Action of the Vienna Congress in 1993, quote, the universal nature of these rights and freedoms is beyond question. That document was signed by the leaders, the heads of state of 171 countries, including the People's Republic of China. Now the question remains about how seriously the leadership of PRC meant it when they signed it, but they did sign it. I would further move beyond those kinds of historical and textual examples to a more conceptual level, in which I would want to maintain that if you look at, well, this is a textual point, but if you look at the text, it brings a conceptual level to the idea to the fore. The Article 1 of the Universal Declaration says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And then it continues, they should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood, sisterhood. We could say in a more adequate, inclusive language, they should act toward one another in a spirit of solidarity. And I think that points to the fact that there we do not have a strictly individualist kind of idea, in the sense that it anti-community idea in terms of the way in which the Universal Declaration of Rights goes forward. The stress is on human beings bound together in community, responding to protecting each other. That this echoes, it goes back, I think you can say, we could take this all the way back to Aristotle, where Aristotle sees the human person as an essentially social animal. Zoon politikon was the phrase that Aristotle uses in Greek. And Aristotle goes further in his Politics to say that the human ability to communicate, to interact with others, which he symbolizes through speech, is what creates the polis. This interaction and communication between persons helps move us toward becoming a genuine community of mutual interaction and respect. Now, I would want to argue, and this is a more conceptual way of thinking about this, that human rights can be understood not only as the right to be left alone, which could be seen as a radically sort of one person at a time having rights. But I would want to argue that the spirit of brotherhood that's embedded in the Universal Declaration leads to conceiving of rights as the rights to be part of the community, the rights not to be excluded, the right not to be marginalized, not to be left out. And that shows up in the affirmation, for example, of the human rights that are usually called economic and social rights. The right to have enough to eat, the right to get a job, the right to be able to work in the sharing, in the interaction of the economy, the right to have healthcare, which today means, of course, the right to be able to share in the complex systems that deliver healthcare. So protection of human rights means protection of people's ability to participate on a basis of equality with others in society. Now, this is not to deny the importance of the respect for individual dignity, but individual dignity is not something that one achieves alone. One achieves it in community. And I think one can argue that the spirit of brotherhood or the spirit of solidarity that's in the Universal Declaration, and also this notion of the incorporation of the economic and social rights means that human rights are not simply being left alone. I like to say, for example, that the right to free speech is not my right to sit in my office talking to myself about my political ideas. The right to free speech is the right to engage with people in the debate about how we should live together. That's why it's so important politically. And these kinds of approaches then would suggest to me that human rights are relevant to societies that are more communitarian in their values, like the societies of the Confucian world, the societies of Africa, which stress the communitarian values. But it also means that an emphasis on communitarian interaction never means that some people can simply be excluded or left out or marginalized. We saw that what that can lead to in the days of apartheid in South Africa, where apartheid was so to be opposed, not only because of the harm that it did to individual Black people, but also to what it did to excluding Black people as such from participation in the life of the community. So I would like to argue that universality can lead us, we can achieve a greater degree of universality if we recognize that solidarity and human rights go together. So I'll stop there and we can continue this later in our more practical discussions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hollenbach, for your comments. I want to turn now to the reputational challenges and bring in Nicole and Mark on this topic. Question for both of you, and that is, with all that's gone on in the US in recent years, the increased polarization, rising religious nationalism, the racism, the violent insurrection at the US Capitol. There's already a Q&A question that refers to the voting rights issue in Georgia. With all of this, what's the status of the United States as an exemplar of human rights? And how would you respond to those critics who say the US should pause or tone down its promotion of human rights until it has its own house more in order? Nicole, let's start with you and then Mark.
So much, Judd. And first, let me just say welcome to Georgetown. So thrilled that you are on the hilltop, even virtually, and just delighted to see what you'll do there. And really wonderful. Thank you, the Berkley Center, for pulling this together. From MSFS's perspective, we're so thrilled to co-host with you all, as well as the Institute of Study of Diplomacy, and I'm delighted to be with colleagues who I've had for many years as well. There is no doubt that the United States has shown the rest of the world how many challenges we have at home. I mean, I think the insurrection that we saw on January 6th was a wake-up call in many ways to show how much work we have to do and how the polarization, how disinformation, how weak leadership can lead to violence and lead to disruption in democracy. And a disruption in democracy leads to the deterioration of human rights. But we have to be honest as well. I don't think that there is one human being in the world, truthfully, who believes that the United States that the shortcomings in the United States started in the last year, or on January 6th, or over the last 4 years. The truth is, anyone who reads our history books knows that the United States has had tremendous shortcomings within our democracy. And when our wonderful, phenomenal country was founded, we had already had 100+ years of slavery, of torture that was legalized in our country for years, and it went on for another 100. And so we have to recognize that the United States has not been advocating for democracy and human rights and these issues, particularly over the last 30 years, because we come from a place of perfection, or we come from a place where we don't have anything to learn. We come to those conversations about human rights because human rights are universal and because they are the right thing to be talking about. And I think what we have to do is say the United States has to approach our conversation about human rights with what I call humble confidence, right? The humility to say, we have had a really difficult history. We have some challenges at home, and we will be humble and honest about that, but confident that the principles and the values upon which our country was founded and that we are living into and will continue to live into do not change because we have fallen short of them. And I think that's the narrative, and that's the challenge the United States has ahead of ourselves. And so as we speak about human rights, we speak about it from that position about the rightness of human rights, not the rightness of the United States and its track record alone. So it brings us to the question of whether the United States should talk about human rights. The reality is the United States is speaking in the world, it is present in the world, it is leading in the world, And so the question is not, will the United States go out and talk about these issues? We will be in the world. Our businesses, our NGOs, our government will be in the world. The question is, should we be in the world and step back and be silent on these issues, which are so important? Or should we step out humbly and confidently and say, as we work on things at home, we will still, in our leadership role, we will still ensure that these values are part of what we're talking about, because we don't serve the world well by being silent about Uyghurs or being silent about Syria, because we are waiting for us to get it together. That type of navel gazing and introspection is even worse than us saying that we have it all right in the first place. So the United States can do both. It can work vigorously on all of the issues we have to work on at home, and we have quite a few, while we also speak about the importance of human rights globally. And in this, I do want to make sure that we are continuing to focus on the marriage between democracy and human rights. Democracy is the only system that enshrines the protection of human rights in its documents, but also has built-in self-correcting mechanisms. And what is that about, right? What is it that has allowed the United States and many other democracies to move out of a period of slavery or civil rights or disenfranchisement of various groups? It is only because the system itself has mechanisms which allow citizens to come into the public square to raise these concerns and for there to be legislative and policy responses to it. You look at what Dr. King did in our country. He went to the streets, he used his civil voice, and he then pushed for legislative change in the house of democracy that we saw under attack on January 6th. And so we have to recognize that democracy remains the best system to protect human rights. And as we all go out and advocate for human rights, whatever angle of it is, we have to ensure that we are ensuring that that strong statement about democracy and about the United States showing that democracy still works is part of our message.
Thank you, Nicole. Mark, I want to bring you in on this reputational question as well. What is America's reputation on human rights, and what can the Biden administration be doing to enhance its credibility?
Well, it's a pleasure to be part of this forum, and Nicole and I have a very similar perspective, especially having in many phases of our careers worked in the same places. I think exactly what Nicole suggests, that we should not have a false dichotomy between the United States being an exemplar and being a promoter of human rights or democracy. There is, to say that there has been a hit on our reputation would be the understatement of the year. And not just the insurrection as something that raises a question about the solidity of our democracy, making one laugh at all the references to those guardrails that would contain Trump, we heard for 4 years. But the forms of Christian and nationalism, we have not solved the post civil rights era issues. Nicole, reminds us that this is one of the self-correcting mechanisms and one of the ways that we move forward. But I think that the Biden instinct is the right one, to emphasize democracy and to reintroduce the United States to the world. By that, there are two meanings to that. He would think of reintroducing us to the world as to step up and to once again be at the head of the table of international leadership, as he once put it in the campaign. That will be hard, because not only are there questions about the United States as an exemplar, but the record of the 4 years preceding Biden's inauguration were the opposite of leadership. They, trying to break institutions, a much more virulent form of unilateralism than we've seen as kind of a natural characteristic of the United States foreign policy. There's a practicality in the domestic scene as well. One might look at President Trump, as an aberration, not representing, kind of the path of the center-right part of the political spectrum. Others think, clearly he wasn't the cause, he was the amplifier of something going on in populism. But Biden may be a kind of, moment in time that only lasts so long, and it will be important to reap. He represents an older generation, one that sort of thinks like John McCain did on the other side of the aisle. And I think it's better both in terms of engaging on human rights, despite this reputational, blemishes that we've taken on in the last 4 years, or evidenced, to also move forward with something like the Democracy Summit, but cannily implemented. I'd step back and say there's a broader practical question that flows from reputation. How do you do this? Well, it is jumping in and talking to fellow powers in the global north about engaging the human rights questions of the global south, but it can't be seen as high-handed, and the United States will have a problem stepping in that way. But I think we need to think of what used to be called soft power. The United States has pursued a foreign policy that has, one bulky muscular arm, which is defense and defense spending, and then a kind of weakened, atrophied side on diplomacy and public diplomacy. And I think we need to think about our calling cards in the world. And that's another way we can be an exemplar, not just fixing problems at home, but the things similar to the PEPFAR program to lead a humanitarian help on HIV/AIDS, other humanitarian roles as well. So let's think about when we talk about tending to our garden and fixing things at home, there is that role for the United States in the world that we can also repolish our jewel.
Well, thank you, Nicole and Mark, for comments on the reputational. I want to stick with the two of you as we transition now to the institutional. And that is, I want to bring something from Secretary of State Blinken. Back in February, he announced that the US would re-engage the UN Human Rights Council as an observer. But he added in that statement, and I quote, "We recognize that the Human Rights Council is a flawed body and in need of reform to its agenda, membership, and focus, including its disproportionate focus on Israel. However, our withdrawal in June 2018 did nothing to encourage meaningful change, but instead created a vacuum of US leadership, which countries with authoritarian agendas have used to their advantage." So a question for you, Nicole, do you agree with Blinken's assessment here? And more broadly, what can the Biden administration do to promote human rights through less than ideal multilateral institutions?
So I absolutely believe that the UN Human Rights Council is a flawed institution. If you look at its membership, it has quite a few countries that respect human rights, but it has unquestionably become a magnet. I shouldn't say a magnet. It has unquestionably become the forum that authoritarian nations and human rights abusing nations choose to enter into and to convince their regional colleagues to support their membership, their candidacy for, in order to shield themselves, in order to say, we're on the Human Rights Council, so we must be doing something right, and to shield themselves from the criticism that they know they do deserve because of their track record on their own domestic human rights issues. I do think there is an opportunity for the Biden administration to lead a reform agenda. It can't do it alone, and it can't do it in a way that looks like the United States is imposing its views for the very reasons that Mark Lagon just shared, that the United States has to do things with other countries now. We don't have, this is not the same situation that we had maybe 10 or 15 years ago, where the United States carried a different weight coming into this context. But that reform agenda has to truly look like it is a human rights driven human agenda, and it has to have coalitions that are willing to come along, that the United States builds to have that agenda truthfully go forward. And I personally believe we have to tie advancing of that agenda to our participation, and others to do the same, to say that we will engage if this body can actually align itself, not singularly with American perspective, but align itself with the very documents, and David Little outlined those important documents from the 40s and the 60s that were drafted to align itself truthfully with those documents. I do think a big part of American credibility on this will be to what extent we're willing to take some bold steps in our own foreign policy. Because if we walk in and ask of this body, which really isn't a body, it's a bunch of states coming together, if we ask that body to do things which we ourselves are not willing to do, it will look a little bit hypocritical, right? And so some of that is we're going to have to show that we are willing to stand up to the Saudi Arabias of the world, those countries that we have close relationships with, but have tremendously problematic human rights violations. And what that will show is that there is a way for the world to say, we are the United Nations, we are a body that invites everybody, but when it comes down to it, we will also speak the truth about certain members and their track record on one specific issue, whether that's human rights or other issues. I do think that there is a chance for progress, and I do think that the United States has to engage, because we've seen this stepping out, stepping in, stepping out, stepping in. And unfortunately, the stepping in, sometimes there hasn't been as much progress, which then adds some fuel to those who would like to step out. And I don't think that either the United States' agenda or the global human rights agenda is well served with this back and forth, while there is a middle ground, which is significant reform and taking on the issues that you've said, the membership issue, the disproportional focus on Israel, and the unwillingness at times to take on some of the issues.
Thanks, Nicole. Mark, a question for you on an institution closer to home, and that's an institution you know well, Congress. For years, there's been a bipartisan consensus on foreign policy matters related to human rights. One can think of religious freedom, trafficking in persons, AIDS, and so on. But of course, with increased polarization, anything bipartisan is harder to achieve. So the question for you would be, what can the Biden administration be doing with respect to Congress in terms of promoting human rights around the world?
Well, and I've had the luck of being involved, whether a congressional staff or a Bush administration official, a volunteer advisor for the Democratic candidate for president and now President Biden, that, we have this special islands of issues where there is bipartisanship. And human trafficking is a great example of it. I work now on issues of U.S. Investment to fight HIV/AIDS and those particularly stigmatized populations like gay men, transsexual people, intravenous drug users, prisoners, migrants. There has been a robust agreement on some issues like that, and I've always wondered whether that kind of bipartisanship could cascade outward from those islands of particular issues. But my fear now, and the evidence during the last 4 or 5 years, has been that the bipartisanship on even those core issues has begun to crumble, or there needs to be a revisiting of the memory of why these things are central to our foreign policy. Joe Biden is suited to the moment in the sense that he has great experience working in a bipartisan fashion. His instinct is that that way. Having driven through the stimulus package, the American Rescue Plan, with a partisan tool reconciliation, that cuts against his desire to restore these values. But he faces something, not just politicians, but the populism that lies behind them. So I think that I think it's good to concentrate on particular areas of policy and not be flummoxed to say, well, will Republicans be part of a bipartisan cooperative policy on democracy promotion when clearly they perceive the US election last November and January 6th a bit differently from Democrats. I think the best thing to do is to start with the particular and move outward. And on democracy, just to plow forward, I will note, that the supporters of Freedom House, which Nicole is about to move on to help run as the #2, the support for the National Endowment for Democracy, these things stayed robust even during the Trump era. And so that the Biden administration would be making a mistake to think that it can't build on these islands. But there's a lot of reintroducing people to a notion. There's a way, I'd like to return to the very helpful frame that David Little and David Hollenbach started with, which is the UDHR. I think there has to be a way that you engage with Congress where you're saying that the values are universal, but they are American values too. Undercut this sense of not wanting the United States to be scrutinized, which the United States has exhibited for years in not ratifying human rights treaties, promoting human rights vociferously and not being willing to be scrutinized. I think a picture here is sort of melding the idea of universal values with these being actually American values and trying to build bipartisanship that way. Also, again, in this respect, I think the Biden administration should reap in the next 4 years for multiple reasons. Biden's age, the fact that the next president after 2024 could either be a populist Republican or someone else from the Democratic Party, perhaps more to the left, and maybe even more focused at home than abroad. And maybe the one or the other House of Congress may flip in just 2 years to the Republican side. You're better off seeking a bipartisan policy, at least in this moment, from a position of strength, if I were the former Senator Biden.
Thanks, Mark. I want to transition now to our final segment, which is looking at some practical challenges. And here I want to bring back in David Little and David Hollenbach. And a reminder to the audience, I see several questions in the Q&A already, so this would be a good time in these next few minutes to be thinking about and submitting your questions. An initial practical question for you, David Little. And this picks up on something you mentioned in your opening statement, that's China. Arguably the greatest external challenge to the United States and its promotion of human rights and democracy is China. China vocally rebuffs any criticism of its human rights record, particularly as it relates to Xinjiang or Tibet or Hong Kong. And it also serves as an increasingly influential and powerful model of authoritarian governance for its neighbors and for the rest of the world. So the question for you, Dr. Little, is how should the Biden administration deal with China when it comes to matters of promoting human rights and democracy, both in China and around the world?
Right. That seems to me the key question, although it is relevant, isn't it, to other areas of the world, Middle East and so on, and we can come back to that. But to begin with China in answering this question seems to me exactly right. In preparation for this program, I read a number of foreign affairs articles on the subject of US foreign policy in China, and I concluded that there is a huge division of opinion amongst Chinese scholars about where China and the US stand in relation to each other. So to begin with, I would say if we proceed with discussions of practical questions like this, we will need to engage China scholars, Southeast Asia scholars, to give us some general assessment of what the future strength and weakness of China is as it interacts with the United States. That seems to me important because in some ways it affects the degree of pressure that the United States might put on China in advocating some of its human rights policies. That is, if, as some scholars argue, China is not a 10 feet tall power, but has internal weaknesses, is not eager to engage militarily with the United States, if that empirically is the reality, that would allow for more pressure from the United States in advocating human rights correction in places like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, certainly Taiwan. On the other hand, if China is 10 feet tall and represents a huge growing military power, that sort of lessens the options open to the United States in standing strong against China. So this empirical question of the strength or relative weakness of China vis-a-vis the US becomes extremely important. A second aspect of that is the allies question. A number of scholars have talked about the pliability, you might say, of the neighbors in Southeast Asia who are torn as between United States and China. And again, what is the degree of pliability? Are they open to US suggestive activities, economic and other, and would they then rally to US support in regard to human rights and other US policies, or are they likely to be drawn into the orbit of China and stand against? So all of those questions, I think, need to be assessed and evaluated in order to make judgments. But it seems to me along the lines of what we've all been saying so far, at least prima facie, the Biden administration has strong incentives based on its commitments to international norms and United States history to propose and stand behind an advocacy of human rights in denouncing and calling to account policies in Xinjiang, the Taiwan question, all of that. I think there are prima facie strong reasons to be assertive in that regard, and yet also humble, of course, and aware of the conflicting and competing realities that we face. So trying to find a balance there of assertion and sensitivity to the reality, geopolitical realities is extremely important. My final comment would be, as far as I can tell, the Biden administration in regard to China, Middle East, and elsewhere is now trying to pick its way. It has, for example, decided to withdraw from Afghanistan rather abruptly, some think, and abandon human rights objectives, as some complain. And yet it is now in the process of imposing sanctions, rather strong sanctions, on Russia. It has criticized the Saudi Arabian government for its specific engagement in the assassination of Mr. Khashoggi. On the other hand, it refuses to sanction Mohammed bin Salman and is therefore trying to find its way. So it is proceeding in a balancing act, which is inevitably involved in these matters, that's the best it can do. And I suppose our job as critics and observers is to figure out and decide whether they've got the balance quite right.
Thank you, David. Mark, I wonder if I could just bring you in briefly to follow up on the question of China and human rights.
There's a connection to bipartisanship, and there's an immense focus on Capitol Hill about China. Yet any conversation goes from one issue straight to China. I think Xinjiang is horrific and also an opportunity for the United States and the international community. The Biden policy ought not to try and do 180 degrees opposite of Trump, maybe about 160 or 170. And I was very encouraged to see the reaffirmation of the State Department legal finding that genocide has been committed against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. I think if we talk about the kinds of the calculus of the power of China in the world, which David Little raises, we should remember also the power of this particular issue. It drives us towards the comparison with Germany and its, attempt to rise again in the mid-century. Also, it is a wonderful thing in this tragedy for so many hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs that the United States would be able to place itself on the side of Muslims because of the perception or misperception of its tilt against Muslims as opposed to Muslim extremists. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. For David Hollenbach, I also want to return to something you mentioned in your opening remarks, and that related to the interplay between human rights and social and economic rights. In his recent book, Not Enough, Samuel Moyn from Yale argues that human rights are not capable of addressing economic inequality. He notes that there's been this rising attention to human rights, while also there's been rising inequality in many places around the world in recent decades. So do you think he's right on that point? And what would it take to have the economic and social rights affirmed as effective norms to advance human dignity and well-being?
I want to make distinctions in my assessment of Moyn. Moyn is a very provocative writer and so forth, and I disagree with a number of things that he says, not only about the economic rights issue and so forth, but on a number of other issues about the importance of the foundational documents of the United Nations on human rights and so forth. But he is right about the fact that inequality is growing in our world, and that is a very serious problem. Where I would disagree with him is in his implication that somehow the human rights agenda, the human rights movement, is somehow irrelevant or incapable of responding to these economic inequality questions. As I mentioned earlier, I think that the inclusion of economic and social rights in the Universal Declaration, and then in the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, that those rights that deal with issues of economic deprivation are really a very important part of the human rights agenda that we should be advocating and pressing and moving forward on. Now, you can say, well, it's not as dramatic as what's happening in Western China with the Uyghurs. It's not as dramatic as what's happening with the Rohingya and so forth. That may or may not be true, but the economic inequality of the world has been growing, and the pressures of this inequality are creating a whole range of other conflicts and pressures on migration and so forth. I mean, all you have to do is look at the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo to see what the kind of pressures that poverty can lead to in that part of the world has done to the broad human rights agenda of the people of Eastern Congo. 5 million plus people have died as a result of the conflict there. And it's largely driven by response to needs for poverty needs. It's not solely that, but it's largely that. Or if you look at what's happening at our southern border in the United States right now, the pressure of migration coming from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America has a lot to do with the economic deprivation and inequality that's operative there. And so the kind of movement of people as refugees around the world is also deeply connected with these economic issues. And therefore, I would want to argue that if we're stressing an adequate human rights agenda across the board, we have to include economic as well as civil and political rights in the agenda that we're addressing. And this is due to the fact that, as it has been argued, it was argued in the Vienna Declaration back in the early 90s, but others have made this claim as well, that the civil and political rights and the economic, social, and cultural rights are in some ways importantly interdependent on each other. And that you can't have an adequate agenda for protecting democracy without having at least some initiatives on the social and economic rights front. And so I would want to say that as we think about our human rights agenda for the Biden administration, I would want them to keep firmly in mind that human rights are about genocide and are about political repression, but they're also about overcoming some of the poverty that's driving some of the conflicts that are leading to the kind of political repression and other sort of actions that are so harmful to human beings. So I think that this all stresses my disagreement with Moyne would be to say that he wants to say that the human rights movement is irrelevant to addressing these problems. I think that's wrong. I think that the full agenda of the human rights movement ought to be taking this on directly and addressing it in a very practical way and trying to find ways to make sure that as we formulate human rights policy, we don't overlook the importance of economic and social rights in the human rights agenda. And therefore, that would be my way of disagreeing with what Moyne has to say there.
Thank you, David. A final question from me before we go to our audience. And I see there's a number of questions now in the Q&A, so thank you for those. And if you have one that you haven't already asked, please do type that in the next couple of minutes. But a question for you, Mark, as we close this segment of the conversation, and that is, we're all together on Zoom because we can't meet in person because of this, the pandemic and the social distancing and so on. You've worked on human rights issues. You also work on global health issues. Perhaps following up a bit on what David just said about the interplay between human rights and social and economic concerns. What have you learned, or what can we learn from the COVID era in terms of the interplay of health and human rights? Want to unmute, Mark?
It's an important question, and I welcome it. I think we have seen vividly in the United States, but also abroad, the ways in which the COVID pandemic has worsened human rights on both the political and civil liberties side and the economic and social side. We've seen those who are most economically marginalized or socially marginalized hit hardest by the disease. And then we have seen states around the world use the excuse of COVID-19, in the name of medical surveillance, pushing forward with political surveillance. You've seen this in Russia and Moscow, more cameras on corners because of the pandemic or elsewhere. A number of people have written about the connection between political and civil liberties and economic and social rights. as different as the former head of Amnesty International, Irene Khan, in her book, The Unheard Truth About Poverty and Human Rights, or the enormously thoughtful Gary Haugen, founder of International Justice Mission, who says that, those who are in poverty, those who are economically marginalized, are vulnerable because they're not treated as like people in full with access to justice. That's the agenda we need to pursue. We need to overturn, the model, in my view, of these being too separate. And Tom Banchoff, as the founder of the Berkley Center, Nicole and others contributed to a book I co-edited 7 years ago, Human Dignity and the Future of Global Institutions. And it appeals to try and use the dignity language of UDHR to meld the two. I'll give one example of a way that policy could pursue this. Everyone, the White House, House and Senate, the world, the G7, the G20, they're all talking about creating some sort of new fund or structure for pandemic preparedness and global health security. So we should think about the impact on civil society and the marginalized and the voice for them that needs to be integrated into any institutional apparatus. The logic that led the United States and others to urge that civil society voices be part of the global fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria is exactly what we need to do. The key is to include marginalized populations and civil society in any policy we go forward on. And that gives a chance of melding the two areas of human rights best.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you all, our panelists, for this really rich conversation. We've had our audience patiently waiting to ask their questions. I want to turn now and have us answer as many of these as we can get through in our remaining 23 minutes together. Nicole, let me start with you. In the question I posed to you, I focused on domestic human rights related challenges that hurt America's credibility. There's a question from Dan Moriarty here where he asks, to what extent is our foreign policy itself a major challenge to our credibility on these issues? And he points to US-Israel policy, the legacy of much of what the US has done in Latin America. And then he asks, can the US ever really achieve credibility without telling the truth about our own continuing history of undermining human rights in foreign policy? Nicole.
Well, first I'll say hi, Dan Moriarty. Dan and I have known each other for 20 plus years. I look forward to having coffee to discuss these issues and not do it through Zoom questions. But it's an excellent point, Dan, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the same humility that we have to say, that we have to show when we're talking about our domestic situation is that we have to say, and we have to own that we have a mixed track record around the world. And mixed does mean that there have been many places where we have chosen to put short-term security, economic, or political needs above human rights. And mixed also does mean we have been a force for good. And I don't say that to say that the former isn't true. I say that to say both of those things live in reality and intention next to each other. But I do think we can't move forward as a credible leader without saying, yes, we have done these things in the past. We also have to start to embody a foreign policy today that doesn't continue to put human rights at odds with security, economic, and political issues. Because for a long time we've said, well, you got to pick one or the other. And then when an urgent security need or an urgent economic need comes, and we say, okay, well, we're picking that one. They're not mutually exclusive, and we have to have a foreign policy that says they actually are intertwined. And to David Hollenbach's point, many of the crises that we see, many of the cultivation of terrorist organizations grow out or have at least in part a human rights component. And if we want to get at some of these issues, immigration, people at our borders, terrorists, these concerns which are seizing the American people, we have to say it's about the entirety of the issue. It's about saying where we have made mistakes, and owning that our foreign policy has to be broad enough to include these issues of rights and include these issues which are central to our security, our economic, and our political agenda. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Nicole. Anyone else want to speak to that particular question?
It's a good one, and I think Saudi Arabia is the best example. I mean, not acting on the Khashoggi matter, there's been an effort by the Biden administration to at least take the step into releasing intelligence finding that he was responsible. But even more strikingly, where human rights and humanitarian affairs come together, the Saudi role in mayhem in Yemen is a policy that needs to shift from the United States and needs our urgent attention.
If I could just dovetail on that, I could not agree more. Mark and I are often very closely aligned. And for those who say our relationship with Saudi is just too important, we cannot have these conversations, I would encourage us to think about this talking point. Saudi, if we want to move forward as allies, this isn't about Saudi picking and choosing. Saudi will be stronger and will be more stable, which they would like as well. They will be more economically prosperous if they stop the human rights abuses, if they open the space for different religious groups, if they open the space for women to be full participants in their society, if they open the space for journalists to have a conversation and to do it the way that Jamal Khashoggi did, which was with challenging the regime to be a more effective regime. And that, I think, is for those who are skeptical that putting human rights as part of our foreign policy will somehow undermine that conversation. We are able to have tough conversations with longstanding allies that say it is in your interest, as well as our interest and the interest of the world, to have these issues central to how we move forward on a security and economic basis.
Judd.
Thanks, Nicole. Yes, David.
I just wanted to raise the question of Egypt. The Biden people have come under some criticism recently about going ahead and extending arms assistance to a regime that seems to be very oppressive indeed. And I take it they're making a calculation that you're balancing the human rights with the national security problem. What would you say about that particular example? And Nicole, I guess, or Mark as well.
I absolutely believe that we have to have a much tougher conversation with Egypt about what they are also doing for American security interests. Mm-hmm. And to say that our relationship, we are not in a passive position with Egypt. Egypt holds political prisoners, including many American citizens. That we had an American citizen who was held as a political prisoner and who has launched a court case to hold his torturer to account. The Biden administration, unfortunately, has recently said that it is not going to lift diplomatic immunity for that individual. These are cases where the United States can say we can stand for human rights, and these are the most basic of basics, holding an American political prisoner. We are able to stand for those cases and pursue a security relationship in which the security is in the interest of Egypt. We're not asking them to do something that we only need. It is in Egypt's security interest as well for that relationship to be strong. And it is not unreasonable for us to say if we provide lethal weapons to a country, that those would not be used to commit human rights violations. That is just not a high bar. And what we need to do is also own that the United States has a little bit of leverage in this relationship to say, we can continue to work with you, Egypt, for both of our mutual, but we do have some very, very clear lines, which include holding our citizens as political prisoners and using the things that we have actually provided to commit the very abuses, which truthfully is undermining the stability of Egypt. It's not making Egypt stronger for them to be committing abuses against its own citizens.
Thank you. A question from Stephen Worth, where he brings up the famous quote from Stalin, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" And he says this raises a key point about the relationship of human rights to military and economic power. With China's rising military and economic power in the world, do we risk losing our moral authority on the world stage? Perhaps as we increasingly compete with China economically and militarily, while trying to also promote human rights. Mark, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think, it doesn't make sense to fight fire with fire. I mean, we should be concerned about China's military reach, but the United States still has a massive, military capability, far outstripping, all other countries. It would be like making the mistake of saying that China has its Belt and Road Initiative and is investing all over Africa, so therefore the United States should have infrastructure investment as well. We need to swallow hard about the initial question you raised. Can we be a promoter of human rights when we've had such striking examples on race, on populism, on the insurrection? I think the United States needs to compete with China in offering a different vision of governance, and it's very hard in the wake of the last couple of years in the United States. But that's the way we should take on China. Otherwise, we will suffer in terms of reputation. We need to offer something different and restore the notion that there's somehow a connection between a socially inclusive and liberal political order and economic prosperity.
I make a comment on that.
David Little and then David Hollenbach.
I just wanted to follow up with Mark on that. I'm concerned about the problem of Taiwan in particular. President Biden has recently been criticized for not coming cleaner on U.S. military commitment to Taiwan. That raises the kind of question that's at issue here. What's your evaluation of that dilemma?
I think it's been a huge mistake and will continue to be a huge mistake not to stand by Taiwan as a democracy, candidly as a country that's a democracy. Even when we changed the precepts of the U.S. relationship with Taiwan, we kept the military commitment to them, and Congress was, in the form of the Taiwan Relations Act, very focused on that. But this is an example of what China could be, and it's important on that level. But after we've seen what's happened in Hong Kong, the people of Taiwan and the leaders of Taiwan can't possibly think that there's going to be a possibility of one country, two systems. So I'd say the Biden administration should be even more forward-leaning than it has been to date.
David Hollenbach, did you want to?
Just a brief comment about the credibility of the U.S. and its in relationship to the insurrection and rising populism and so forth. This is probably not a directly human rights concern, but where the populism is coming from in the United States, it seems to me has something to do with the inequality that Sam Moyne is worried about, that the pressure coming from sort of less educated working class people and so forth that led to certain aspects of the Trump agenda, it seems to me is one of the things that's undermining our international human rights orientation, both in terms of reputation, but also in terms of policy, in terms of the way that the Trump administration wanted to go. So that would suggest to me that that addressing some of these questions of inequality in the United States could relieve some of the pressure that's creating negative impacts on our international human rights policy in terms of causing some of the kinds of protests and actions that are contrary. So again, this is another way of saying, it seems to me, that some of these economic questions are interconnected with the full human rights agenda in a slightly different way than what I said earlier, though. But that's just an added point.
Thank you. David Hollenbach, to continue with you, there's a couple of questions from Philip Fernandez. that mentioned Pope Francis. And I wonder if I could sort of put you on the spot here and ask, given that we have a Catholic president, what should the Biden administration be doing in concert with the Vatican to promote human rights around the world, or in what ways can Biden be partnering with Pope Francis or learning from Pope Francis?
Well, thank you. I've, as a Catholic priest myself, I'm very interested in this question, and it's a very important one. Pope Francis has clearly been strongly emphasizing the importance of creating sort of transnational response to the needs of people around the world, both in the area of political freedom and also in the area of economic well-being. And his most recent encyclical letter, Fratelli Tutti, it's the Italian taken from Francis of Assisi, which means brothers and sisters all. We're all in this together. And he has a whole section in that document about human rights and the importance of the promotion of human rights across international borders. So I think that as the Biden administration moves forward on its human rights policy, the Vatican would be very interested in talking about it and dialoguing about the appropriate contributions that can be made by the United States and ways in which the church might be able to facilitate that. And of course, the Catholic community in the United States, the impact of the teachings of someone like Pope Francis on Catholic attitudes on this could be good if it's carried out effectively by the leadership of the church in the United States. And so I think that there's a very strong overlap of the papal agenda on human rights and social solidarity around the world, international collaboration, and a possible direction for the Biden administration. And this could lead to both a broad visionary kind of approach to things, but it could also have impact on certain more concrete areas of negotiation that might be, the Vatican played a significant role in the restoration of U.S. relations with Cuba back in the Biden administration. And so the church can play some roles in some areas where human rights issues are very important, and both on the more intellectual and sort of value level, but also on the more practical level in certain narrowly defined cases. So I think there's a lot of room for collaboration there.
Thank you, David. As I was scrolling through the questions, I also saw one dealing with Burma, or Myanmar, where at least partially democratic system has been swept aside by a military coup. Wonder if any of the panelists have thoughts on what the Biden administration should be doing with respect to Myanmar as sort of an immediate test of the administration's commitment to promotion of democracy and human rights.
Well, just one brief comment on that. I mean, Mark Lagon mentioned before about the threat against the Uyghurs in Western China is clearly, analogous as genocide to what happened with the Jewish people under the Nazis. The same is true regarding the Rohingya. I mean, there are international court judgments already that haven't reached a final decision, but the preliminary conclusion is that this looks like genocide in Burma. And so if we're talking a human rights issue, genocide comes pretty close to the top, it seems to me. And so I think the Biden administration ought to be finding ways to put pressure on the Myanmar government to change its direction in this area. This is a very severe problem affecting a sizable number of people in a very gross way in terms of a gross violation of human rights.
Thank you, David. There's a few questions that sort of get at this issue of how can the U.S. be a promoter of human rights if it has done or does do X in some country or on some issue. And maybe Nicole, you had mentioned the Biden administration should have a posture of, I think it was humble confidence, which I quite like. I'm curious, what does that look like in practice? Does that mean just apologizing at every opportunity for historic injustices? It brings to mind the Republican criticism of Obama in his early years, where he took quite a nuanced view of American foreign policy. And Republicans bashed him for apologizing for America. Mitt Romney wrote a book even entitled "No Apology." So is that dangerous territory for Biden and others to step into, where they are expressing regret for U.S. actions or the consequences of U.S. actions?
I take sort of a middle ground. I don't think we should go around apologizing every turn that we can, because I do think the United States has been a huge force for good in many, many corners of the world. And I don't think that we step back from that as part of our history. And I do think that we should own where we have made mistakes. And I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. I think our brains have sort of cognitive dissonance. It's sort of like the conversation in the United States. We've got to talk about slavery. We've got to talk about our nation was founded with glorious principles from the beginning. Those two things are both true, and they live in, it's hard for our brains to wrap ourselves around it, but they're both true, and we have to both live into the best and account for the worst. What I hear, though, in the question is if we're still doing certain things. I don't think we can step back from security and economic and other objectives. We need relationships, back to the Saudi question. We need to have relationships with countries, but what we need to do is start moving. We cannot pull back because some of our allies abuse human rights. We can't pull back fully. But what we can say is that we will not engage as fulsome as that country would like to, and that relationship will not flourish in its fullness because this is a barrier to that full relationship. And we can do both. We can engage where we have real security concerns and where we have real economic interests, and say to those countries that that human rights, those human rights issues are going to be a barrier to full engagement in our relationship, and that we are going to calibrate those two things. If we hold them as polar opposites, I don't think it serves the entirety of our values and interests, which I do think are aligned and the same.
Thank you, Nicole. David Little, you have a comment on that.
I just wanted to follow up on Nicole's comment. I spent 2 months teaching in Hong Kong a couple of years ago, and in one of my seminars, I had a group of mainland Chinese students and was much hammered at the time by US failure to live up to human rights standards. What I did was, I think somewhat successfully, was to use that as an occasion to apply human rights standards universally. In other words, I accepted their complaints against the Trump administration and in fact embraced them and joined with them in applying the same universal standards to US behavior that I then proceeded to apply to Chinese behavior. It seems to me that's exactly what you want to do. You want to hold yourself, let's say to begin with, to account in order to apply the exact same standards to others. That's universalizing universal standards, I think, in an effective way.
If I could just say one more point on that, we have understandably come under criticism, and the George Floyd murder and others has put that in stark contrast. And I've heard people say, but what about the United States? What I say is, yes, that is symbolic of one of the biggest issues the United States needs to work on. And what did we see after George Floyd? People going to the street, peacefully protesting, people engaging their parliament, their local legislatures and their government to bring change because there was a shortcoming in the country. We'd love to see that same thing we'd love to see Uyghurs in China peacefully protesting, engaging the government and saying, we want change. That to me is what this is about, which is there will never be complete eradication of all human rights abuses until we are able to say that there's got to be a system that underpins it, that brings the people's voices and allows for that change so that everybody can enjoy those universal rights.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, David. I think that's a good note to end on, though I see, Mark, you've got a comment to follow up on that. I'll give you the last word.
Sorry to squeeze in, but I do think this drives home how the United States must be an exemplar or a better exemplar and a promoter of human rights. I recall when I had the privilege of being the ambassador to combat human trafficking at the State Department, dialogue with India and, saying you need to help all those who are suffering from bonded labor. You've had laws since the 1970s to liberate them and give them restitution. And the official I met with said, but in the United States, in a similar federal system, we can't make the states do something. And I said, well, we did discover something in the 1960s that we could, in fact, push that. And subsequently, under the next ambassador to the combat human trafficking, India did begin to move on human trafficking, despite all of its problems today. We need to be both an exemplar and a crusader. I have one suggestion for a place we can start at home. Change that differential treatment of African Americans for drug use that exists. And there is a basis of a left-right secular faith coalition to make that happen. It's a good place to start.
Thank you, Mark. And I want to thank David Hollenbach, David Little, Nicole Bibbins Sedaca, and Mark Lagon for being with us today, for engaging with our audience on a whole range of questions. Thanks to our audience for being with us, for asking so many good questions. I'm glad we could get through many of them. My apologies to those that asked questions we weren't able to get to. Again, the recording of this webinar will be on the website within the next couple of days, and you'll get an email with a link to that video. I want to also give my thanks to the Berkley Center and to our co-sponsors for making this event possible. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.